But another one, obviously, is Puerto Rico. You'd think this would be getting more attention, but Puerto Rico, a lot of protests have been happening there over the past couple of weeks in relationship to just the colonial realities. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Dr. Adriana Garriga-López, who's an associate professor of anthropology at Kalamazoo College and an adjunct professor at the University of Puerto Rico. Doctor, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, I think you're muted.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Sorry about that.
No problem at all. You know, this is the world we're living in, the mute, the unmute, the camera on, camera off. It happens to all of us. You know, I think probably the thing that has probably gotten the most attention from Puerto Rico in the past couple months has been the large protest by teachers who have been out protesting in terms of their pay. Just for those who maybe didn't see it, before we get into the details, talk a little bit about what is happening there with teachers and public sector workers in Puerto Rico.
Sure. Well, I'm happy to be here talking about this really important issue. And what's happening is that teachers in Puerto Rico are standing up and demanding a fair wage and also demanding fair retirement. So part of what is involved in the agreement reached through the Fiscal Control Board for the bankruptcy process they designed for Puerto Rico is severe cutbacks on salaries for public workers like teachers and severe cutbacks on retirements that had previously been promised to them. And so I think people were kind of waiting to see what was going to be the outcome of the process. But once the courts decided to approve the budget with all of the cuts that it includes, I think we've seen a ramping up of resistance and a very clear demand from people in Puerto Rico that they want to be able to live in Puerto Rico with dignity. They want to be able to feed their families. They care about the work that they're doing, and they're simply not being given the resources to be able to do it. And so it's really wonderful to see the solidarity that the teachers have generated. We've also seen firefighters joining the protests. Today, we saw the arrest of employees of the Transportation Authority in San Juan who blocked the offices where they work this morning, preventing people from coming in, also demanding a living wage. And there's been continued resistance to the expectation that there's going to be even further cuts and even deeper and worse austerity than Puerto Rico has already seen during this period in which people have been trying to recover from Hurricane Maria, which was not even 5 years ago, and of course the ongoing earthquakes that are taking place in Puerto Rico, as well as the pandemic. So given that context, I think people are fed up. They're ready to demand what is rightfully theirs, and I'm in support of all of these protests.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you brought up the Fiscal Control Board and austerity because, I guess it's a month ago in January, there was the bankruptcy settlement that took place in Puerto Rico. And, you know, the way it was sort of portrayed in the media is that this has saved Puerto Rico and it's made everything solvent and it's all going to be good and fine. I mean, talk a little bit about that settlement, if you could, and what the impact could be in terms of austerity, if you've already mentioned.
Sure. Well, the idea that this settlement creates financial stability for Puerto Rico is a complete mirage. It's a fantasy because by their own accounting, by the Fiscal Control Board's own accounting, the plan that is being put in place will not have Puerto Rico out of the red, and it won't sustain Puerto Rico so that we could, the expectation is that we will see a need for another bankruptcy within 10 to 15 years in Puerto Rico. So the idea that this agreement somehow solves the problem is just false. But it is a win for investors, for some investors who want to recuperate as much money as possible on their investments. And so it's a win for somebody, but it's clearly not a win for public employees in Puerto Rico who know that these payments to investors are going to be made on their backs. And at the same time as that debt obligation is being put into place for the next 40 years, 40, 40 years through this agreement. See people like Natalie Yaresco, who just completed her tenure in Puerto Rico, but decided to stay on in the island because she's having such a good time, who was paid over $5 million, $500 million. This is something incredible.
Wow.
To do this work. And even she has called for the repeal of the tax incentive laws that are creating a crisis situation that is different but connected to the one that we're talking about in terms of public employees.
I want to take
go ahead, please.
Very quickly, I want to just take a step back because I don't think a lot of people know what the Fiscal Control Board is. It's like this unelected U.S. imposed body. Could you just give like a brief, for those viewers who aren't familiar with what you're talking about, can you give a brief background on what the Fiscal Control Board is?
Absolutely. But the Fiscal Control Board is an instrument devised through the Promesa legislation passed under President Obama, designed by Republicans, implemented in 2016. And that law called for the creation of a Fiscal Control Board that would have to approve the budget for the Puerto Rican government. So this entity has powers over and above the elected representatives in Puerto Rico, including the legislature and the governor, right? So what we've seen over the last few years is a kind of negotiation between the government in Puerto Rico and this Fiscal Control Board, which is completely staffed by bankers and investment bankers, et cetera, to negotiate the budget to try to bring it back into alignment with a payment plan. But in that process, the University of Puerto Rico has seen its budget more than half removed. We have seen hundreds of schools closed, public schools closed in Puerto Rico, famously under the direction of the criminal Julia Kelleher, who has now pled guilty to 19 counts of fraud in that process. And many other unbelievable situations in which the people of Puerto Rico have been fleeced in the service of this irregular bankruptcy process, which was necessitated by the removal of Puerto Rico from the federal bankruptcy legislation in 1984. So Puerto Rico used to be able to use bankruptcy laws, but in 1994 it was prevented from doing so. And that led to this situation in which there was no way for Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy. And that's why Promesa then generated this avenue, which was the Fiscal Control Board and the process in the courts that led to the approval of the current budget, which is the one that public employees are protesting against.
I mean, maybe this seems obvious to some people, but I think it just feels so colonial. I think obviously for most Americans, the image they think of Puerto Rico, they think, oh, it's just like a state. There's just like a democracy. It's a part of America. But just looking at how essentially no matter what Puerto Ricans want, Wall Street, the government just does whatever they want. I mean, is this what people mean when they say it's a colonial relationship?
That's part of it for sure. But Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. It's a territory of the United States by the United States' own admission. And so there's no doubt about that. There's no debate about whether Puerto Rico is a colony or not. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States. And so this process that we're seeing with the Fiscal Control Board and basically the takeover of Puerto Rican government and finances in Puerto Rico by legislators and these investment bankers is the direct result of the congressional doctrine of unincorporation, which holds that Puerto Rico is an unincorporated territory of the United States, which makes it, and I quote, foreign in a domestic sense to the United States. So what is foreign in a domestic sense? It's basically the creation of a category of exception that then allows for mechanisms like the tax evasion scams that are drawing extremely wealthy Americans to Puerto Rico, which is leading to a huge housing crisis where people in Puerto Rico are not being able to afford, not just buying homes, but renting homes. And we've seen such a huge influx of people who are trying to live out their pandemic dreams in a tropical island. And so that has led to the literal displacement and takeover of communities in Puerto Rico because of this tax incentive that is based on the colonial exception of Puerto Rico as an unincorporated territory. But there's an additional element, which is that Puerto Ricans have been living in Puerto Rico are also not eligible for those tax incentives. So it is very clearly a plan to replace the population of Puerto Rico by bringing in wealthy investors on the model, I think, of what happened in Hawaii more than a century ago, right? Where eventually Puerto Rico will be merely, the population of Puerto Rico will be merely in positions of servitude to wealthy investors and vacationers in Puerto Rico. That's the vision for so-called economic development in Puerto Rico, and it's a nightmare for anyone committed to, continuing to see Puerto Rico, be full of Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rican culture. We're seeing all of that under threat.
There was something else that happened in Puerto Rico that's related to a lot of this, and that was the power outages that were taking place. I'm not sure what the situation is with power outages now, but there was the privatization of the electricity grid that led to massive protests over power outages. I'm curious if you can maybe give us a bit of background on what was happening there and an update on where things are going with that.
I can try. That's a long story, but I can try to tell you what I know.
The Cliff Note version. I apologize.
Right. I'll give it a shot. So we've seen, the privatization of the electricity system in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria under the logic of recovery, which has really been a smokescreen for anti-union policies, union busting. And that union for the electrical company in Puerto Rico was one of the strongest unions in Puerto Rico. And this privatization dealt almost a death blow to that organization. So we saw many workers just unemployed or moved into positions where they were redundant or where they had no previous experience, or desk jobs that had nothing to do with their extremely specific skill set. And knowing this electrical system better than anyone, they were basically pushed out of that market. And then U.S. workers working for U.S. companies who bought the electrical system came in and took over those positions and are being paid sometimes twice and three times what Puerto Rican workers were paid. And there was a period in which there were many blackouts and the people were very angry about the poor service they were receiving. It seems like the service has stabilized somewhat. It's definitely been a little bit more stable, but everybody knows that the minute that there is a serious storm or a hurricane that comes through Puerto Rico, that system will be equally as vulnerable as it was before Maria. So nobody is thinking that the problems there are solved either. It's just that that deal was done, and it was very painful to see those public employees pushed out in the way that they were, their skills and knowledge disrespected, especially after the sacrifices that they had made to put the system back together after Hurricane Maria. So we're kind of in a wait and see situation right there. But I think lots of people in Puerto Rico are aware that this is a fight for our lives, for our communities, for our families. And there are many, many issues. It's not just the electricity issue. It's not just the living wage issue. These are super important ones. But another issue that I'm very concerned about when it comes to the electricity is that this privatization also included the privatization of water reservoirs that were tied to electricity production in Puerto Rico. So, I have a lot of questions about what that means in terms of the privatization of water sources in Puerto Rico, and so on and so forth. These issues are all interlinked.
No, I think that's a very well taken point. And, I'm glad you also mentioned the issue of the tax incentives and people moving down there, because there also seems to be an attempt to maybe in a stealth way privatize beaches in Puerto Rico. The Act 22, I think, makes all beaches public property, but we've seen some protests around that. What's going on there?
So what people need to understand is that the Puerto Rican Constitution, the Constitution of the Estado Libre Asociado of Puerto Rico, declared that the beaches belong to the people. So the beaches in Puerto Rico cannot be privatized because it is codified in the Constitution that the Puerto Rican people have the right to use the beaches, to use coastal areas up to 30 feet in from the tide line. So those are public lands that are being invaded by people who are buying homes under a U.S. understanding of the coast being privatizable in Puerto Rico. You cannot have a private beach. So if you are reading a real estate ad that tells you that this apartment or this house or this condo comes with a private beach, they are lying to you. Those are public lands that are being invaded by hotels, by private developers, and also by people with a sense of entitlement, people who just think that because they bought a house on a street that they get to tell other people how to use public lands. And people are not going to tolerate that. And we've seen extremely creative responses to that. Beach parties, volleyball tourneys, people just saying like, hey, everybody, let's show up to the beach. We're going to demonstrate that the beach is ours. And it's not a protest of the sort that people in the U.S. are used to seeing. It's a protest with music, with traditional Puerto Rican bomba y plena, with dancing, with people hanging out at the beach. But it's a very lively way of asserting Puerto Rican culture and the right to be in Puerto Rico, to use public beaches. And we're seeing people who are trying to make that impossible or trying to create situations in which there'll be confrontations, and also very little attention paid to the ecological damage being caused by these developments, which some of them actually build into the water, like into reefs. So we are also before a crisis of permits. Like, who is giving these people permits to build on coastal areas that are clearly public lands as protected by the Puerto Rican Constitution?
That's a good point. I really, we're gonna have to look into that. Who is giving these people permits? And it does raise another question in my mind about some of these politicians. I mean, I've seen the governor and his response to the teachers essentially saying, if you don't want to accept a poverty wage, you can just leave. And then when people said, well, are you going to apologize? He says, what do I have to apologize for? I mean, you know, who does he represent? I mean, so many of these politicians, it seems like they can't be representing the people.
I can answer that question just by telling you that before he was governor, he was the lawyer of the Fiscal Control Board. Wow. That's who he represents. He represents the investors, no? And his family members are real estate agents selling luxury properties who are benefiting from Act 22. I mean, we are seeing, how can you expect better from a governor who declared himself governor in his sister's house at night in the summer of 2019, after Ricky Rosselló declared that he was going to resign, that he tried to take over the government by having himself sworn in his sister's apartment. Okay, so that's who is governor right now. We are under the control of somebody who has no qualms about selling Puerto Rico to the highest bidder. But he is under threat by protesters who are very angry, and people who have promised to not take this line down. And the people of Puerto Rico in the summer of 29 made it clear who owns the streets of Puerto Rico. And so that is definitely something that has been very present in the last few days, in the last few weeks, people making themselves felt on the streets, artists, teachers, firefighters, even police, all kinds of different people. Like I said today, we had for the first time people arrested for protesting, demanding a living wage. And so we are seeing, and we're going to continue to see, an incrementing public activism around these issues. And I know that eventually the people of Puerto Rico will be victorious against these unfair, colonial, and violent impositions against our people.
Mm-hmm.
On that note, I'm curious, you know, I've heard people have different takes on the issue of statehood. So, like, what are the different positions on the issue of statehood, and does it fall like more left or right, or is there kind of an argument from each side on what would be best for Puerto Rico?
I think the latter is the case. The politics around pro-statehood and pro-independence don't really line up with left or right exactly. They don't really line up exactly with Democrats and Republicans. There are people who are pro-statehood who are Republicans. Many of them are very conservative, very religious, and very much what you would think of as a conservative. And there are people who are pro-statehood who are liberals, who are Democrats, who are even social democrats or socialists, right? So we see a variety of people on that spectrum. Likewise, on the independent spectrum, you have quite a variety of political positionings. But it's clear that there is a question of values around Puerto Rican culture that does line up in a certain way with left and right. But it's quite complex, and you can get as many answers as there are Puerto Ricans to what it is that should happen. And I think there's clearly a process of national consensus building, a constituent assembly that needs to take place. so that the Puerto Rican people can dialogue amongst themselves. I hope to be a part of that amongst ourselves to find a solution to this colonial tragedy that has befallen Puerto Rico, not just for the last 120 something years under the United States, but for 500 years under Spain before that. So, you cannot tell me that a statehood is decolonization. That is not decolonization. That is just annexation, further incorporation into the metropolis, okay? There may be some equalization of rights that happens as a result of that, but that is not decolonization. No, so we need to enter into a process of self-determination that actually seeks to repair the damage done by these colonial ideologies that have taught Puerto Ricans to think that we are not enough, that we cannot govern ourselves, that we cannot feed ourselves, that we cannot sustain ourselves, that we don't know how to do that, right? That precisely is the result of these colonial ideologies that have forced Puerto Ricans to be dependent on federal transfers, right? So we need to enter into a long process of decolonization. And for me, that cannot include statehood. I'm pro-independence, and I would like to see Puerto Rico become a republic. That is my goal, but hopefully also so that we can be in collaboration and community with other Caribbean nations. And Puerto Rico doesn't have to be alone. Like the choice isn't, the United States or bust, right? There's a whole other world out there. So I hope that we can find a way to have these conversations and actually, raise these questions and move away from that polarity of statehood or independence and actually seek, to arrive at some kind of consensus around self-determination and end this territorial status, which is literally killing us.
Mm-hmm. Well, inspirational to see what the people of Puerto Rico have been doing, and I think inspired the whole world, quite frankly, in 2019 and doing it again now. Mm-hmm. Dr. Garriga-López, we really appreciate you joining us, helping us sort through all of this and understand it, and really honored to have you here. Thanks for giving us some of your time on the freedom side.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.